Massive welcome to all our subscribers, first-time watchers and LinkedIn viewers for a special episode here on InfoSec Live, where I'm joined by Martijn Bosschaart from Salt Security for a deep dive into API security and what is the new monster in the room. Before we get started, a little bit about our guest. Martijn is a 30-year IT veteran, always trying to hop on the innovation train from Citrix to Nutanix to now Salt Security. In Martijn's own words, the more disruptive the technology, the bigger the impact you make. But before we get started and bring Martijn on, and for those new to the channel, I'm your host, Simon Lindstedt, and by sharing stories and best practices over the last few months, it's led to 250,000 views here on YouTube by you, our amazing 11,300 subscribers. So a huge thank you for your support. And a special shout out today to our summer YouTube channel sponsors, Salt Security and CyberOne Solutions. Thank you for making it possible for us to keep producing great content here on InfoSec Live. Links to find out more about them are on the main YouTube channel page. I'm trying to bring up this QR code now. I clearly can't do two things at once. Quick reminder as to where all of this started. In the not-for-profit InfoSec Live community, where we have now approaching 7,000 global members in a dedicated social network for cyber professionals. Please do join us. The QR code to scan to join us is there. If you're not brave enough to scan that QR code, which I understand, again, there is a link in the description for you to click on. If you enjoy our content, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you're watching this live, do drop any questions in the chat. We want to make this as interactive as possible. And I see Prashant, you've already dropped one in there. So thank you so much for that. And if you're watching this on the replay and you have any suggestions for future content you'd like to see on the channel, drop me a message here or on the InfoSec Live community. Okay, time for me to stop waffling on. Let's bring Martijn on. If I can find the button. Well, wrong camera. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, Simon.
We were just saying how wonderful technology was before we got started. Probably I was too keen to mention that at the point. But Martijn, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share this with us today. Before we get started, would you mind just giving our audience a little bit of background and intro to yourself, please?
Yeah, sure, Simon. Thank you for having me. Like you've been saying, I've been going from cloud vendor to cloud vendor. Started roughly 30 years ago as an IT consultant, then joined Citrix as a vendor. Right when the whole working from home thing kind of kicked off. Worked there for about 7 years, then made my move to Nutanix. That's when cloud infrastructure and hybrid cloud really came to be. Again, worked there for 7 years, and now already since 2.5 years, I've been working at Salt. My primary focus at Salt is our channel ecosystem. So I do a lot of training, enablement, and evangelizing. The word of API security. And that's
so you've got 4.5 years left at Salt, is what I heard there, Martijn.
Well, yeah, don't tell them, but if I make it again a 7-year stint, that would be it. So, a lot can happen in 4.5 years. So it always feels like a lifetime, even though you've been at a startup company for a short period. It is very dynamic and very rewarding to work in. So,
and I think from a geopolitical landscape at the moment, change is definitely on the horizon at lots of countries around the world. I mean, we've got billions of people going to allegedly democratic elections this year, but could put a big change on everything. So yeah, absolutely, things change very quickly. Let's kick it off then. I'll hand over to you because I think you've got something to show us before you begin, haven't you?
Yeah, so I'm going to do a little storytelling. So I'd like to take you into the world of API security, and of course tell a little bit about first of all the why, and I'll set the scene first, and I'll give you a little demo of what the rest of the presentation is probably going to be about. So let's quickly switch this over. So the title of the session is all about a monster, right? So. There's this new problem in the API world, and it's slowly becoming a pretty unmanageable problem. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this problem actually started and what we should actually do against it. And of course, this is not helped. Well, in some way, it is helped, but it is how do you say it, amplified by all these new technologies like GenAI, etc., coming up. So APIs first. What is an API, right? An API is a very simple mechanism to exchange data. It's literally an answer to a question. And APIs have been at the forefront of what we see now as cloud native app development, right? So if you look back 15, maybe 20 years ago, the notion of APIs was more in the back end, like systems management, a little bit of automation. But nowadays, all applications are built based on APIs. And we do this for tons of different reasons. First of all, agile application development. I can cut up my application in small parts, and I can distribute it over different teams. I can even do it out-house. I can very easily deploy or scale independently. So the reason for APIs being the basis for cloud-native apps is 100% valid. That's no problem. The thing is, however, though, is that the whole dynamic of building the application, but also the security changed. And if you look at yesterday's applications, they were kind of monolithic, right? We would stage up a web server, put a lot of code on it. We can have a client come in, request a page, the code would run, fetch the page, data, send it to the client, and that was it. So your attack surface was that individual host, that monolithical application. The problem is, however, nowadays, what we do with APIs is cut up applications. So in essence, what you're doing is you're exposing all these different pieces of business logic individually. So your attack surface is growing dramatically. All the individual features and functions, sub-functions of applications are now accessible directly through a URL. And that makes it also a little bit hard to control. So we need to find some sort of a mechanism to make sure that we can properly secure those. Now, what isn't helping is because that attack surface is growing, it is becoming harder to secure, right? That attack surface, normally it was one single web host. We can do a little bit of infrastructure around it, web application firewall, that kind of stuff. And if we had to plug a leak, we would know where to do it. And then slowly, as the attack surface starts to become more and more larger, more places where this thing can leak happen. And especially now with the era of generative AI, it becomes very, very easy to build an API. So they're growing dramatically, and that accelerates the problem even further. So what we see now happening in the news is that AI is starting to promise a lot of growth and transformation, but on the other end, the security risks are going up dramatically. Because if developers start to use generative AI, who learns what AI does? We humans. We make mistakes. We were not flawless. So where do these AI engines get their information from, and what do they present back to us? Can that be fully trusted, especially when you're writing code? And do these Gen AI engines apply best practices? Do they have security in mind? Are they conscious of what they're actually delivering? Because the problem is that AI is nice, but it isn't aware of what it's actually delivering you. So if you start to trust on it, it's going to be a little bit dangerous. Now, what we see because of this, and I'll give you an example in a minute in how easy it is to create an API using GenAI, is that growth is causing a problem. The interconnectivity is going to cause a problem because we're starting to lose visibility slowly. Right? If you ask Cloudflare recently in a report, they said 57% of all the traffic that goes through that CDN is already API or API related. 57% of all that traffic. Well, you can imagine what others like an Akamai or what kind of other CDNs you have, what kind of traffic they process, how much of that is already API driven. So it's absolutely massive. So let me show you how easy it is. And I don't hope I'm going to scare the audience because of this a little bit.
I think we're already a little bit scared, Martijn.
Okay, so I've prepared a message for it. Hi, ChatGPT, good day to you. Always be polite. If AI eventually takes over the world, you better be friends, right? So very important, be friends. So please create an API in Python that allows user creation and updating user information with some basic user information. That's my prompt, nothing more. So let's enter this in. And what now? You see, it's polite back. See, it's good to be friends. So what it will do now is actually it will tell me exactly what prerequisites I need to be able to run this API, but it will also start to code that API for me. But the thing is, and if you see the screen rolling already, you probably already find out, okay, it has assumed certain parameters like an email address, like age. Where did it get this from? I didn't tell it to put age in it. So it's already making certain assumptions of what I actually would like to do. Now, it has also given me a little explanation of setting up of the API itself, but let's see if this code actually works. So I'm going to copy this code over. And I'm going to quickly put this in a script, and I'm going to call it application.py. I'm going to save this, Control X, yes. And now I am going to run it. Excuse me for my bad typing. Sorry, Python version 3, I'm going to use. So we've started this little script, and the server is now already running. So that was everything I had to do for it. So we now have a web server running on my local machine that has this API's backend. But now we need to talk to it and see if it works. Okay, let me see what API or what ChatGPT can help me. Can you give me some curl commands to test it? And it will give me a couple of examples. Okay, if you want to create a user, if you want to get user information out of this API, if you want to update this particular user, and basic error handling. So there's a couple of simple code commands that you can just simply do and test your API if it's fully functional. Now let me grab the first one, create a user. So I'm going to copy the code again, and let's dump this into here. And I'm going to write the command. Let me allow this. It's a curl command. It's going to talk to my API host. It's going to create a user. What I can see from it, it's given it the name John Doe. It's given it the email address and the age 30. And there we go. Users created is fully functional. I get a backend response of 201. That means that it is a fully functional API in this case. Now, the next thing that I want to do is, okay, give me that information back. Let's see if it actually written this information. And I'm going to just request it. And you can actually see in the API's database, which is now currently in memory, I have my data. It has my age or the age. I wish it was my age.
Me too.
Yeah. So John at example.com and John Doe. So this is what it actually assumed. But the first thing is it didn't give me any security. It didn't ask me what parameters were in there. So in terms of best practices, this is a very rough concept, but it could be a starting point for further code. So this is what a developer could actually take and then continue on. But you can go much further than this. You could actually also say, please provide a permanent database to store the information.
Can you ask it to make it secure as well?
Yeah, you could, but in some way you could ask basic user authentication, etc., but it will revert you to, you need to implement firewalls, etc. It will tell you to do a lot of things around it. It will not solve the entire security problem for you. But that is not the biggest problem, actually. It is the business logic that you create with the API that is actually causing the issue. It's not so much securing the API in terms of access. It is actually what will the API be able to do in the backend. And that's a little bit tricky. But while I was answering your question, what it now actually tells you here is exactly how to stage a backend database. In this case, it's going to use SQL Alchemy, and it's going to be pretty simple to actually put some infrastructure in place. So in this case, a developer doesn't really even need the infrastructure team. He can stage this himself pretty easily. And then the question comes up, but who's going to manage all this? And what kind of assumptions are in the code? And what things are you not following? Is this adhering to standards, etc.? So we've been in this presentation now, or this part, for roughly 5 minutes. I got a fully working API with a database backend set up. So that's how easy it is. If that's not scary to you as a CISO, I don't know what is, right? Because this is how developers will work. And I'm not saying this is bad. It's an absolutely great starting point. But who's going to govern all this? Who's going to make sure that it is up to the standards, internal standards, best practice, but also industry standards like GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, all that stuff. And that's the scary part, right?
Thanks, Martijn. We've got a question in. It's a generic one. I can hear myself talking back. I'm not sure if you can hear that as well. Can you, or is that all right?
No, you're
Is
good.
it gone there? Okay. Mad Dog Prash has put, why do project managers dislike security professionals to the point where security is the last point of call and the concerns are made to feel irrelevant, especially around application development? That sounds like personal experience to me.
Yeah, and it is a very good question, a question that should always be raised, because what we see normally in application development is that the developers rely on the security professional to secure the product, right? So they're in charge of securing the perimeter, putting a web in place, API gateway, and all that stuff. The developers themselves, they are concerned with the business logic and not so much with security. The security people, however, normally don't really understand what the business logic functionality of an application is. So how does the actual application work? So we have a gap here. So it's a very, very valid question. And security is often seen as an obstacle. Those are the guys that ask all the nasty questions. And but the problem is we need to bring these two parties together. We need them to work together because if you want to focus on API security, do not treat it as a product. Do not think that you can buy this as a little box that you shove next to your web application firewall and boom, API security is there. No, it
But
is a strategy.
isn't that the problem with the industry? I mean, I'm not an industry expert. I've come into the industry after spending over 20 years in governance, oversight, and compliance functions in financial services. And one of the things that struck me the most since being here is how vendors have shaped the narrative that everything's solved by tools. And I know you work on behalf of a vendor, so maybe this is the wrong tack to take. But I think as an industry, we're not very good at focusing on the people and the processes, or we haven't been since I've been in here, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's a very valid question. And I can honestly say, as an API security vendor working for one, I'm going to tell you, Salt is not going to solve this problem by itself. We're going to help you to build processes around it and build proper posture and governance. But there is still work in it for you. You have to adopt this. You have to bring people together. You have to bring processes together, and you have to bring technology together. This is not a point solution product or a problem that's solvable by a point solution product. Not going to happen.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
let me explain a little bit of why this is also important, and this will dive in a little bit further into what's the gap between security and development, right? Let's take a look at the impact of an actual API breach. What happens when things go south? And these are a lot of familiar logos. Probably you might be a customer of one of these or a user of one of these, and they all have a lot of things in common. First of all, they're very big logos. You know them. They're very big companies. They have very sophisticated application development. They have very big security teams. And they probably have every bit of security-related hardware or software somewhere in their architectures worldwide. These are big buyers in terms of cybersecurity. The problem is, over the course of the last couple of years, they all had massive breaches, and some of them even more than once, that all happened over the access of an API. And they already had web application firewalls. They already had API gateways. So what are they then missing? So for instance, T-Mobile, big in the news 2 times last year, Optus as well, and in upwards of 40 to 50 million user records leaked, right? That is a massive amount of data that got exfiltrated. That is not an accidental text file left on an open S3 bucket in Amazon. That is something that needed the actual help of some sort of middleware exfiltrating the data, but at the same time go unnoticed. So that's a massive blind spot that happened, right? Same recently, Dell in the news. This is only a couple of weeks ago. Somebody managed to actually steal 49 million customer records in a data breach over the access, again, over an API. So how could they not have noticed? Because when they notice that this happens is normally when the whole database gets sold on a Telegram channel. That's normally when they find out. So what's making this happen? So how can they not notice this data exfiltration? And that has to do with the way API tags work. But another dangerous statistic, and this is to reference Gartner recently in their market guide for API protection, is that they say that whenever a breach happens that goes through an API, the amount of data leaked is 10 times more than an average breach. So it's not only slightly bigger, it's 10 times bigger, right? And that everything has to do with the fact that the hacker is not trying to find bugs in your code, or he's exploiting some process he can crash or whatever, or he's actually using an API in a different way than the original developer intended to. But from an API perspective, it works fine. And that is actually why these breaches happen. That's why they go unnoticed. And I'll give you an example in a couple of minutes how that actually works from a backend perspective.
Before you move on, just going back to the slide before that, where you mentioned that all these companies had a WAF and they had API gateways.
Yep.
Can they not add features to that to solve the problem, or is that not possible?
Yeah, you could do some things with API security. Of course, an API gateway already does a little bit of API security, but it's mostly focused on access to the API, right?
Yeah.
It can do a little bit of schema validation and that kind of stuff, but that's where it ends. An API gateway by itself has no idea which part of the data is actually sensitive. If it's a credit card, or if it's personal identifiable information or patient record, it doesn't know. So whenever data gets passed through an API gateway, it might not really care about it. It misses the context of a certain request and also the context of the data going out. A web application firewall can only do so much because it's an inline device. It can only look at an incoming request one at a time. So it's also missing context, but also it's missing a longer scale of view. I'll go into an API attack after this, but API attacks are also more longer drawn out. And this has to do with the fact that a hacker first has to learn how your APIs are working. There's no 0-day exploit for your specific APIs because your APIs are unique to you. So they spend a lot of time on reconnaissance, and the reconnaissance itself often looks just like legitimate traffic. The hacker is already registered. They get an account to your website or open a bank account even if they wanted to. And they're looking around like a normal user. So the problem is with a WAF, in this case, it can only look for a known bad or a little bit of behavioral deviations, like, for instance, a little bit of DDoS protection, that kind of stuff. But if a request comes in and the request itself is valid, it has no idea of the user intention with the request. And that's where those inline devices fail. They can do a couple of things. They can do predictable and recognizable attacks like SQL injection and the log4j attacks of this world. They can recognize those. But for instance, a broken object level authorization attack, and I'll explain what it means in a minute, is an attack that doesn't look like it's an attack. And that's the dangerous thing with API attacks.
So it's back to having the context around it as well.
Yeah, you need to understand what normal looks like first before you can determine if a request is actually invalid. But you cannot look at the request from a semantic perspective. You cannot look at it if the syntax is okay. That doesn't mean that the request is not malicious, right?
Yeah.
So it could be perfectly formatted, but it could have a bad user intention, and this is what we're trying to find out.
Okay, thank you.
So the thing is with all these big breaches happening is that why did they happen? And it actually boils down to three main categories of problems. And the first thing is that a lot of companies have a hard time of knowing what APIs do they have, right? I just showed you in ChatGPT. It literally takes me a couple of minutes to build one. Can you imagine if you have a very big application development department, how quickly they can churn out APIs? Do you know which ones they built? Do you know what the purpose is? But also, do you know what data is in them? Because API is nothing more than a mechanism to exchange data. There could be a lot of sensitive data in it. You could be communicating all sorts of PII going out. Do you know? So a risk assessment is very important. What risk is associated with those APIs? Which ones are interesting to hackers? Which ones aren't? But also, again, like I said before, do those APIs meet all the corporate standards that I have set for myself? But does it also follow industry best practices and also regulatory requirements? So are they MI, PCI DSS compliant still with the APIs that my developers built? Or am I accidentally sending credit card information in the clear? Right? I don't know yet. That's a lot of that's a big part of the problem that companies have: visibility. You cannot protect what you cannot see. Big mantra in cybersecurity, but it's also true for APIs.
And I suppose that's one of the questions I've got written down here is where should people start with API security? And it's the same with everything. It's discovery, I suppose, isn't it? And working out what you've actually got.
Yeah, and I'll dive into that process. So where do you start with? Because you cannot solve this by implementing a whole sort of things all at once. You have to have a starting point. But yeah, discovery is where everything starts with. I first need to know what I have before I can make any sane decision on where to focus on next. All right. Now the second pillar is that, and this is something that will become a little bit more clear when we dive into how attacks actually work. Is that API attacks, they evade the traditional web defenses. Like I just said, an API gateway and also a web application firewall, yeah, they can block known bats, but the unknowns, they don't do anything against. And the low and slow API reconnaissance that normally happens first is undetectable because it looks like legitimate traffic. And since the hacker is not trying to exploit bad code, it is just trying to use an API in a different way that you intended. These defenses are not up to speed. They can help a little, but the most problematic attacks will go past unnoticed. So that's a big issue. And then the third part is, what do we do with all the information? And this is where the first question came up with. So yeah, the developer people, security people, there's a gap that needs to be bridged. So we need to bring these people together. So the information that we get and this threat intelligence that we get from APIs, we need to feed back into the organization to make sure that problems don't happen again or problems are prevented. That's even better. But the thing is that a lot of current tooling isn't integrated. So what we try to do, or what you should try to do, is bring this together, right? So if you look at existing product shields or production shields, even tooling like a basic SIEM, yeah, it does reporting, for instance, on security events or incidents, but not in the context of an API. I need to give you a little bit more information. What was abused? Why did we think this was a threat? If there has been a breach, what kind of data was exposed? So you need to be enriching that ecosystem. And then, of course, security testing tools, right? So the thing is that a lot of API testing still happens in a synthetic way. We fire off a script, a bunch of Postman collections with a lot of known vulnerabilities against the code. But is it really testing against things like the OWASP API Top 10, or is it even taking business manipulation into consideration? Because that is a really important one. If you want to test business logic, you're not testing code, you're testing scenarios. In which way can I use this API? And the problem is, you need to come up with all the scenarios in which your API might be used. And you will never be able to complete that list. The hacker will always plus one on you because he has the time to find out, hey, can this API do this? Can this API do that? So it's very tricky. So you also need a new approach to testing. You need to be more, yeah, you need to do more dynamic testing, right? But yeah, let's dive in how an attack actually works, and that's even to scare you a little bit more, but it is very very easy. But there's generally four areas in which API attacks happen. The first one is because you didn't know you had it. The second one is abuse potential, right? The API works properly. There's no bug, but its results are unintended. Flaws in the business logic, and then finally everything that has to do with stolen credentials. And the dangerous part is that most of the attacks that happen in API landscape are combinations of different techniques. For instance, somebody already has stolen credentials, so he's already in. Then he finds an API that can be abused. It can be used an unlimited amount of times to manipulate a piece of business logic. So it's always different techniques strung together. And these techniques are covered in the OWASP API Top 10. And this is a list that has been updated in 2023, but was born in 2019. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the OWASP Web Top 10, and a couple of the things are the same, but most of these things are actually unique and new to APIs. Actively, we as Salt, we have a division with analysts, Salt Labs, actually worked with OWASP to update the 2019 OWASP API Top 10 to 2023. It already tells you how quick this thing is going, right? But it is a top 10 for a reason. That means that the number one, the A1, the Bola, or IDOR, that's also how it's called. But yeah, is the attack that is the most prominent. Whenever you hear that a large amount of data was able to be exfiltrated, it is very, very likely been a Bola. And what is a Bola? It is just a security mishap in the backend. And let me illustrate it with a little story to help you better understand. So let's say, and I travel a lot for my work, and I check into hotels. And when I do this, I go to the front desk and I get a card, and my key card is my token. My token gets matched with a door. And in this case, I can go up to the first floor. I can go to door 101. And because I am authorized to access that particular door, the door should open. Right? So little green LED, doors goes open. Absolutely perfectly fine. How do they know it's me? Because I've made the reservation, proof of payment, and I've identified myself at the front desk. That's how I got the key. So I'm an authorized and authenticated user. Now, let's say I had a very busy day and I stuck a little bit too long in the hotel bar. You all know how that goes. I accidentally, the next night, stumble up to the wrong room, put my key card in, and oh, it doesn't open. No worries. I can just walk to my own door, open it again, and I'm set. But something doesn't happen. And that is, nobody comes up from the reception immediately looking at, hey, why is this person going to door 102? Why did he try to open it? No. Why? Because it's a common thing to happen. People go to wrong doors all the time, and they trust the mechanism for not letting them in. So we don't need to be looking at it. We can safely ignore this little mishap. There's nothing wrong with it, right? Door doesn't open, no harm done. Person got to his own room, fine. We didn't even log it, probably. Now, if I were a burglar and I want to break into Martijn's room, my room, because I have a nice laptop in there, a nice MacBook I want to steal, there's two ways you could do this as a burglar. I can dress myself up in a nice burglary outfit. I can put a crowbar around my neck and try to dash it to the elevator. That's my first little problem already. The front desk is probably going to stop me. Hey, sir, why are you going up to the first floor, etc.? You need to check in, blah, blah, blah. That's the first sign. So it's already suspicious what this person is doing. So there is a known bad already happening. But let's say I make my way up to the floor and I am going to door 101 and I'm going to use my crowbar to break that door open. That's also going to be a very recognizable attack. It's going to make a lot of noise. It's going to damage the doorpost. It's probably going to set off an alarm if that door opens because the door mechanism has been forced, but no key card was used. So there's probably a rule in place to check for the security infraction. So most likely, alarms are going off. Somebody's trying to burgle the hotel. I'm also leaving a lot of forensic evidence. You can see the door has been broken into. I can see the lab book is the notebook is missing. Maybe I even can see fingerprints, etc., from the door not being used. So it's very easy to say, okay, I have been hacked. I know what data was missing in a traditional way of an attack. And here comes an API attack. What do API hackers do? They're not coming in with a crowbar. What they actually will do, they will invest a little bit. So they will book a room in the hotel, provide an ID, which might be false, pay for it. I don't know, stolen money, you never know. But they authenticate themselves as a regular user. So from a authentication perspective, this user is already in and looks exactly the same like I was. Now, this user goes up to his room and room 102 has been assigned to him. So that door will open, right? And here comes the catch. This user, malicious intent, is now going to my door with the key card to see if it opens. But no, his card is not authorized. Do you notice anything different than me going to room 102 on accident? No. It's exactly the same situation, just reversed. So nobody's going to be alerted on the fact that somebody with a key card 102 has been trying to get into room 101. And here it comes. The next day, he's going to try room 103. And then the next day, he's going to try room 105. Every day, a different door. Same thing. Nobody's going to get alerted because it is a normal occurrence. But we now, you, Simon, me, everybody in the audience, hey, we see a pattern develop. And that is the reason that we need to zoom out when we're looking for API attacks. We need to look at behavioral patterns more often. Now, the thing is here, let's say one of the doors is incorrectly configured and it does open. Who gets alerted? Nobody. And why is that not happening? Because the door opened for the key card. The result of the transaction was valid. It was authenticated and allowed. So the data or whatever stuff is in room 999 can now be stolen and nobody's going to notice. This is pretty much what a Bola attack is. So it is actually somebody trying to find a flaw in the security of a backend object. That's it. The API is working perfectly fine. There was no flaw on the API. There was a security mismatch at the backend. So somebody forgot to check. So that's what is pretty much it, right? So if you put it in a code perspective, here's two code examples. And apologies for the small letters, but follow on the yellow ones. So there's a couple of things at play here. So in the legitimate request, the top you see a GET request. The GET request is talking to an endpoint called customers, and it's providing an account ID. That is me providing my token to a door. That's pretty much what's happening here. A backend process then determines if that token should be matched to the door, or if it's matched to the door. And it will open the door and show me what's inside my hotel room. In this case, this particular object shows me my user information. This is a very common thing happening in any app. If you open your LinkedIn app, you click on your face, a similar request like this is happening to get you to your profile settings or whatever. It's all being generated on the fly in the backend, but this is pretty much what's happening. We have an authorization, you're logged in, you have a token, you're trying to access a record, and the record is displayed if you're authorized. Now, what is a Bola? A Bola can be a super subtle manipulation of that particular GET request. And in this case, you see, again, a GET request, but only the last digit was changed and different user ID was presented. But I'm saying still the same user. I'm the user. This is the username that I presented myself with at the front desk. This is my key card, but I get somebody else's information. This is a typical example of a Bola. And these come in many different forms. This could be the ID to a shopping cart. It could be a patient ID. It could be some other transaction that follows next in the change of API commands. Bolas come in many ways and many different forms. But it is super simple to pull off. And now getting back to the fact, can a web application firewall or an API gateway see this? Well, look at the request. Is there anything malicious in here? No. It's a regular request. The backend server then responds with 200 OK. So API gateway is going to let this pass. There's no malicious intent from a web application firewall or a detection for malicious intent by a web application firewall. So this data is just going out the door. So it looks exactly like what a normal user would do. And this is very dangerous because most of these malicious Bola attempts, they can just be drowned out in the sheer amount of traffic that is legitimate. So you're not even going to notice, right? So the legitimate traffic is probably going to completely drown out all the illegitimate traffic.
Is it a random thing, the Bola request? Is it just a case of them trying random things until it works, or is there more of a science behind it, Martijn, for the less technical of us in the audience?
Yeah, first of all, what a hacker would do, they would try to find IDs that are probably sequential or easy to guess, right?
Yeah.
Because that means if there's a pattern in it, if there's sort of a naming convention or numbering convention in a certain ID, that makes, hey, then I can actually script and automate this. So in this case, the ID is too easy to guess. I could probably guess from this particular ID that this was a user created in May 2023, and one user was the first one, another user was the second one. So if an ID is easily guessable, yeah, you're setting yourself up for easy manipulations if you don't have the security properly set. There could be other more sophisticated ways, but it is trial and error. So a hacker will try to see, oh, this ID, let's see what happens if I up it one number. At worst, what would happen is he would get a 401 return, an unauthorized. Okay, then he knows, okay, that's not the way to do it. But he has time to find out because that 401 error that he just triggered,
that
if
didn't
you don't
flag
do
anything
it,
up either.
No, yeah, but nobody's going to look at what the hacker did anyway, because we're going to ignore all those 401s because we trust the system. But it could also be a little probe by a hacker testing to see where the gaps are, and that makes it tricky. So yes, it is science, but it's also perseverance. They have time to work on it, and we've seen manipulate or actually intelligence gathering attempts that took months before an actual attack happens, because they know how to fly on the radar. If you don't do this 60 times in a second, nobody's going to notice. If you do this once every 10 minutes, no rate limit is going to come in effect, and you can just walk the data out or at your own pace, and that's what the danger is. Right.
Scary.
To give you a real life example, is an analyst a while back, not one of ours, but it's a known case. Somebody found out that they could go into their subscription page of their mobile phone subscription at Verizon, and they could change the contract number, and there was a contract ID in there, and he found out that he could do this not just once, but he could make an array counting up all the way 2 million numbers more. So he was able to just exfiltrate 2 million customer records. And yeah, if you do this low and slow and not trigger anything, this data walks out the door without Verizon and security people knowing that it was happening. And yeah, this is nice competitive information, right? Knowing everybody's phone number, knowing everybody's subscription information and details, etc. And that's how these bolas work. So they're very, very easy to pull off. They're extremely hard to detect, and that's what makes it so hard.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to do two more because I don't have time to go to all the OWASP API top 10, and we have to be at some point stop talking about it. But the next one is broken authentication, right? The biggest problem with most API attacks is that the user is already authenticated. They're already in, either by a legitimate way, stolen credentials, or maybe even brute forcing, credential stuffing, whatnot. So this is why an A2 event, a broken authentication, is so high on the list, right? It is actually taking advantage of a malfunction or an absent layer of security. It might very well be that the login page of a website checks your credentials and does it very thoroughly, but then the individual endpoints never check for a token. Yeah, why are you doing it then? That's like putting a nice little gate in the middle of a soccer field and everybody can walk around it. That doesn't really work, right? So there's tons of different ways in which you can have a broken authentication. We recently covered that there was a very, very big flaw regarding Booking.com and the way they implemented and used OAuth. And OAuth is actually trusting social media entities to provide centralized one-time or single sign-ons, right? You can use your Google or your Facebook account to log into a particular site. And we actually found out it was easy to manipulate the token that was issued by these particular entities to take over an account, and in this case, book a vacation on somebody else's expense. Right? That is a typical example of broken authentication. But a couple of others are credential stuffing, session hijacking, leaked API keys. There's tons of different ways that users can come in. And to give you a little code example, we were able, and this is an actual example of a now customer, where we were able to use GraphQL. And GraphQL has this very nice property of using nested API queries. That means I can send one request that's actually a lot of other nested requests within that particular request. So I'm not going to trigger a rate limit. I'm only sending one request, and then a whole sort of sub queries are being run. And they had a one-time password system to reset passwords, but they didn't invalidate after 5 attempts or lock a user out. So in a matter of 10 minutes, we're using a couple of these nested requests, we were able to reset somebody else's password and do an account takeover. And this customer really thought, hey, I have this OTP system, I paid for it, and then it's broken. Yeah, so can you trust the current security measures that you have? And by way of using an API in a very smart way, you would be able to breach an account. So that was a big scare for the customer, right? But these are all examples of A2s.
I imagine they signed up after that, Martijn, didn't they?
Yes, they are now a happy customer, and we helped them with a couple of other problems as well. So that wasn't an issue. So yeah, the third one is we call it the Bola. Bola is actually sort of a Bola, but then a subset of something. So if you have a request, it will return you information, but an object like a user, like user information, it has individual properties. An individual property of user information is, for instance, its age or an email address, etc. And if security falls short on those particular items, we're talking about a broken object property level authorization attack. Give you a couple of examples of how they work. For instance, a hacker could be very annoying by changing, for instance, the price of a booking for someone's hotel room by adding additional parameters that are blindly accepted by an endpoint. For instance, in this case, somebody has an endpoint that is used to approve bookings, and what does a hacker do? They add the total stay price to be $1 million. That's going to be very annoying at the front desk where you want to check out. So one way, what the developer should always do is whitelist the parameters that they will process. Never blindly accept all the inputs that a request might send. And it happens a lot because it still is a number 3 position, right? Another example of this is rights elevation. So on the left, you see a request that is an API endpoint that creates users. So developer creates this endpoint, tells the front-end developer, give me these parameters, then I will create the user for you. But what the hacker tries to do in this case, he adds a lot of additional parameters to try and see if he can get root access or admin access. And because he doesn't know what kind of backend user database you're using, he's just going to add a lot of them and see if one sticks. He's literally using the shotgun approach. But if you blindly accept all that input, if you don't secure those properties, and you're going to process them and actually honor them, we're talking about a Bola attack. Another one is, for instance, don't over communicate information. In this case, I'm talking to an endpoint on the left that says, okay, how do I register, or I need to register an email address? And the response comes in and it says, okay, I've created a user for you. This is your email address. But I also show that the email verified field has still been set to false. You know, as good as me now, if you register somewhere for an account, they always ask you we'll send you an email. You need to click on the link and activate it. It's pretty much what happens here. So they send you a link. That link will actually, in your user settings, flip a field to true to make sure that you're validated. So what could a hacker also do if he finds out that that field is part of the user property? Hey, why not try to set it at the moment I'm creating the user? And if you again blindly accept this, you will immediately create the user, but also at that point validate the email address without needing access to the actual mailbox using this exploit, and that is an account takeover. So that's how simple these things are, right? So you need to be constantly on the watch. What am I whitelisting? What will I process, etc.? And these are very common. Another name for these kinds of attacks are mass assignment attacks. So adding parameters and not properly securing them or blindly processing them. So that's another one.
Thanks, Martijn. I know we're close to running out of time, so I've got 3 or 4 questions that have come in that I want to address. Do you want to talk about how we solve this problem first and leave them to the end? Or let's do that.
Yeah, because maybe we'll probably answer the question. So so how do we solve this problem? And we already got the question in first place. So where do you start, right? And the first thing is, you have to have proper posture governance. But that starts with discovery. I first need to know what I have. I need to feed all my API data into something that can make a clear catalog, that makes an inventory of all my assets, that identifies all the sensitive data that's in motion, right? And also allows me to map what APIs are developed by who's the owner, and what's the function of it. That's the first part. We first need to crawl before we can walk. The walk part is then, okay, now that I know what APIs I have, I want to impose my standards on them. What rules do I want to enforce? What does the industry force me to do? What does my do governments request me to do, or what does a certain regulatory instance or institute want me to do? And I need to adopt these, but I also need to make sure that I then will enforce these. So I need to have something that can actually say, hey, you're out of policy here. What I also need to do is make sure, okay, can you then tell me what are my riskiest API assets? Where do I need to focus first? Because you're probably going to come up with thousands of APIs, maybe even more. Where do you start? So that is posture governance. Now, with that piece in place, the next step is then threat protection. Because we not only inventory all APIs, but we also know then what is normal behavior. And this will allow us to then discern the user intent. Where the API gateways and the webs struggle, we can now help them by using AI and machine learning modeling to really see, okay, what is normal? What parameters are normally fed? How often is the API accessed? What kind of data is returned, etc., etc.
And how crucial is that AI and ML aspect in this part of the process?
Well, it's extremely important because the amount of data that goes through APIs is massive, right? So there's a lot of data in there, and you saw how small the manipulations could be.
Yeah.
You as a human are probably not even going to be able to spot them. It's a needle in a haystack, or a stack of haystacks, pretty much. We're talking about customers that have billions of calls per month. We even have a couple of customers that have billions of calls per day. You are not going to be able to find that very small manipulation. You need AI to actually process and handle that massive amount of data to be able to accurately model and prevent a massive amount of false positives, or worse, false negatives, where you didn't know.
So that answers the question on why one couldn't just use their SIM capabilities then, doesn't it?
Well, you still need this because obviously your SIEM is used for a little bit more than just API security. You use it to correlate other events in the infrastructure. Well, it might not be API related. But what we need to do is we need to feed the threat intelligence that we find into a customer SIEM. So this is why we also focus on integrating with customers' already existing infrastructures, right? And that is pretty much what the architecture picture tells you here. So I'll build this out quickly. But what we do is from the bottom, we feed in all that API data and both request and response. Why is this so important? You will not be able to detect an attack by just looking at a request. The response is important. What kind of data is it returning? So you need to see both things. We feed that data into a data lake where all the AI modeling then happens. That's where we learn what is the normal use of an API, how often is it used, what's the call sequence, etc. We map hundreds to thousands of different attributes. So this is also impossible for security team to try and catch with policies or rules they have to think of themselves. This thing needs to learn itself, right? And with this, we feed a lot of functionality. So we feed into the inventory to make sure what you have, make sure that we can help you be in compliance with policies. We make sure that we adequately address the gaps. We will be able to, if there's a gap, create very concise information how to fix it, and then share that with your defect management or ITSM systems. So it's a very, very broad platform. And simply a system like this, you couldn't contain this in a single VM or an appliance. This has to be a cloud scale engine to really pull this thing off. Did that answer all the questions, or can you?
I don't think it did. No, I've got very comprehensive, Martijn, don't get me wrong, but there are a couple that I was sneaking through. One is a generic one from Brian, which is the first one that came in, which I'll bring it up on the screen, actually. Let us both read it, make life easier. What emerging technologies or trends do you think will have the biggest impact on API security in the near future?
Well, yeah, GenAI is pretty much the biggest one, to be honest. So the hyper fast creation of APIs, that is going to cause the problem. And if you are, as a company, trying to stick with the more incumbent and traditional technologies, you're going to have an issue. So on the other end, GenAI creating a problem, we're also seeing more and more uses of AI machine learning to solve the problem, to counteract it. So that's where most of this is going, in a more hands-off approach. But the whole purpose of this is to spend less time on actually solving the problem, because that's why most of these API attacks happen, because we lose too much time trying to find out what's going on. So a lot of technologies also that we are now creating, like Pepper, is an AI engine inside our dashboard that can actually that uses a large language model to explain to you exactly how an attack worked. Because you might be a security analyst, but are you an API security specialist? Probably not yet, right? So I don't want to say dumbing it down, because that's not respectful to the role, but explaining it so that we can immediately take action and save time off the forensic part of something. So that's where all these technologies are going.
Thank you, Martijn. Just a comment this time from Gillian Yong in the audience there, who said she'd like to learn more about the nested queries and OTP example, because that one was shocking. I'm trying to paste some bits in here for you, but it's not letting me do it at the moment. Let me try again. So I've got some links that I want to share with the audience. While it's not letting me do it, I've got no idea why. Let me add them in afterwards. I'm trying to drop a link for Salt Security. I'm trying to drop one for CyberOne Solutions, who are Salt's partner and also a supporter of the channel this summer, and also a supporter of the InfoSec Live community as a whole since last year from an events point of view. If you want to catch up with either of those companies or find out more, links to them are in the description for the YouTube channel. I will drop Martijn's LinkedIn profile in the chat after the event on LinkedIn. For those of you watching on LinkedIn, I think that's you, Gillian, so that you can connect with Martijn after the show. But one last question from me, and we've talked about, talked about securing our own APIs. What about third-party risk, Martijn?
Yeah, that's also a big one, because if I incorporate a third-party API into my own set of applications, did that particular company adhere to the same standards that I adhere to? How did they develop that particular API? And what you also will see now is things like JetGPT, etc., being queried from within internal applications. Yeah, what kind of data are my people sending to that particular engine? Am I not sharing all sorts of sensitive data to these AI engines that are now using my data to learn? So third-party APIs are tricky. You don't know how they are developed, where they are developed, what are the standards. And we have seen recently, for instance, that a third party could be responsible for breaching and leaking your data, right? The big Snowflake incident with Ticketmaster recently. There was a big issue. So Ticketmaster data got leaked because of an intermediary platform they used. And that's where the leak actually started. And those things happen with APIs also. So you got to be wary of this. And everything that you do with APIs, not only your own APIs, but also third-party APIs that you incorporate into your own code, should be under the same scrutiny. That's
Absolutely.
how. Yeah.
And for those that have got multiple partners, that's quite a job in itself, I would imagine, Martijn.
Ideally, it also depends if you are an actual. Do you adopt that code or do you host that third-party code in your own data center, or are those parties you work with, are they hosting the APIs? Because then you would also need some sort of a security measure at their end, because you want to make sure that not only your own traffic is secured, but you want to make sure that you're not getting exposed because somebody else is actually being a bad actor, right? So this needs to be solved through the entire ecosystem.
Thank you, Martijn. And I found a little bit of a workaround for the links. For those brave enough, there is a QR code on the top left-hand side of the screen right now, which is Martijn's LinkedIn profile. If you want to connect with him, I'll just give it a couple of seconds to give you a chance to scan that. And then the next one I'm going to bring up is CyberOne Solutions. If you want to connect with them, the QR code for that is at the top of the screen. So Martijn, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share this with us today. I feel like there's more we could have covered. So if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back on over the next couple of months during the summer. If you're not jetting off on vacation somewhere lovely, I'm going to be at home all summer. So
yeah, should be fine. Well, after summer, we're back at it. So with CyberOne, we're hosting actually a workshop. So if you're interested in actually doing your own API hacking, but also doing a little bit of protecting and remediating, then put Wednesday, September 25th in your agenda.
Do you have a link for that, Martijn?
Yeah, the link is on the is in the bottom, and if you take the QR code, you can find it. You can also find it on LinkedIn. If you just search for CyberOne, you will find it as well. So it should be there. Feel free to join, and that's also an eye opener. That's not only showing you the problem, but also how you can actually effectively solve it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Martijn, thank you very, very much for your time. Everyone who's tuned in with the questions as well. And for those lurking in the background, not asking questions, thank you so much. And for those watching on the replay, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Please do leave any comments in the chat. Any feedback would be great. Enjoy the rest of your day. Martijn, I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, thank you. Likewise.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.